It's time to close out this series on Josephus and Jesus with a look at arguments made against the authenticity of the shorter reference. And really, there's not that much to look at here. One atheist critic was so desperate that he made a big deal over the fact that Jesus was named before James, even though James was the subject of the sentence. But that's kind of silly. There's no logical connection between being named first and being the subject of a sentence. And besides, it would make sense that Jesus would be named first since he was the better known of the two men. Then there was an argument that because Josephus doesn't explain here what he means by Christ, this must have been written by a Christian, because Josephus's pagan audience wouldn't know the term. But that assumes far too much ignorance by Josephus's readers, and ignores the fact that both Tacitus and Pliny used the term without explanation as well. And then there's... Does anyone have any more arguments?
Ew! Who turned on the Munsters?
This isn't the Munsters. I'm Aron Ra, a brilliant freethinker and historian, and I'm here to tell you that Josephus' only mention of Jesus is now known to have been a forgery or redaction inserted later by someone else.
Oh, please. First of all, Mr. Ra, there are 2 mentions of Jesus, not 1. Second, this whole series we did shows that the references were not forgeries or redactions. Get with the program.
Oh yeah? Well, Josephus also wrote extensively about Herod the Great, but never mentioned the slaughter of the innocents, the story of Jesus' childhood, which mirrors the tale of Moses' childhood. That's because they're both just stories following popular themes, so there too. Yeah.
Okay, that old canard. It's just the sort of crap you'd expect from a guy who thinks a website like solarmythology.com is a reliable source. Fortunately, we've already taken care of all of that junk.
Say what?
Yep, watch it and weep.
Wheel! Oh! Stupid!
Hello, folks. It's time for Wheel of Stupid. This time we have another cutesy Facebook graphic to deal with. One that makes a big deal over lack of mention of certain New Testament events in non-biblical sources. The implication apparently being, hey, this is proof that these things didn't actually happen. Let's give that wheel a spin, sweetie. The subject is Herod's slaughter of the baby boys in Bethlehem. Will our fundy atheist contestants be able to stand up under interrogation? Let's find out. Fundy atheist number 1. How many baby boys did Herod order killed?
Well, there must have been at least a gazillion.
I'm surprised he didn't need to take off his shoes to count. Fundy atheist number 2. Who should have mentioned Herod's action other than the New Testament?
Oh, come on. Josephus would have said something. He wrote it down each time Herod kicked his dog.
You think that's a little overstated? Fundy atheist number 3. Are there any more good objections to the historicity of this event?
Yeah, like I said, the story of Jesus' childhood, which mirrors the tale of Moses' childhood. That's because they're both just stories following popular themes. So there too. Yeah.
Oh well, that's the sort of objection we covered in another series. Keep your seats and stay tuned. Many fundy atheists, as well as some serious scholars, have observed that New Testament stories of Jesus in some way echo stories told of other figures in the Old Testament. They may even note that the accounts in the New Testament use some of the same words and phrases as stories in the Old Testament. Clearly, the people of the New Testament era were in some way calling on the Old Testament to invoke the earlier stories, and fundy atheists assume this means the New Testament authors simply ripped off the Old Testament stories and wrote Jesus into their script, without a shred of real history behind them. Their explanation, however, fails to account for an important aspect of the social world of the New Testament, one in which skilled and purposeful imitation was an imminent sensation. When we use the word probability, we generally refer to the chance of a certain event occurring, but I'm going to give you a new way to use that word taken from this book, Molina and Nyrie's Portraits of Paul. The authors use the word probability to refer to what amounts to a verification from general experience. In the New Testament world, a teacher, speaker, or writer would strive to present the material in ways that actively brought to recollection some earlier common experience. This would obviously give a teacher, speaker, or writer every motive to report what they said, whether true or false, or do what they did, in terms recognizable from previous experiences. What does this mean for historical accounts like the Gospels? In another context, we presented this extended quote from the oral tradition specialist Albert Lord. The use of forms and language from earlier texts was a staple of all good teachers, historians, and writers of the biblical world. Even the most reliable ancient historian, Cornelius Tacitus, made use of this technique. Modern historians might use footnotes to draw parallels between different events, but an ancient historian like Tacitus, in the words of one Tacitan scholar, embeds such points in the very language which he uses. He did this by crafting linguistic echoes and structural similarities for his readers. The skill it took to do this was highly admired in the biblical world, and in their era when memorization was so important, it brought a person great honor to be able to perform this skill with quality. Socially, then, the answer fundy atheists offer when they accuse New Testament writers of inventing their stories is off the mark. Rather than arguing that the New Testament writers scoured the Old Testament for events in the life of important figures like Elisha, then adapted those stories to fit Jesus, it is contextually more accurate to say that the New Testament writers, especially one like Matthew who was well trained in the Old Testament traditions, scoured their memory for Old Testament texts that could be adapted to describe the daily life of Jesus. Or that Jesus himself, seeking to indicate his superiority to a prophet like Elisha, purposely sought out ways to reenact events from Elisha's life in ways that made it clear that he was superior to Elisha. As a brief illustration of the bankruptcy of these claims made by fundy atheists, let's look at one example given from Randall Helms in his book Gospel Fictions. Helms notes wording similarities between descriptions of Elijah in 2 Kings 1 and of John the Baptist in Mark 1:6. Both Elisha and John are described as wearing a leather belt around their waist, and Mark uses some of the same Greek words that are found in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. From this, Helms leaves us to deduce that Mark simply made up things about John in order to match him to Elijah. But hold on a second. Helms is making a big deal over these two correspondences, but doesn't ask himself how meaningful they really are. We can dispense easily and right away with the second parallel, around his waist. Well, if you're wearing a belt, where else would you wear it but around your waist? This parallel is meaningless, and if both Elisha and John did wear a belt in their real lives, it would certainly be no chore for Mark to draw that phrase from the Greek version of Kings to tell us about it. What about the wearing of the leather belt? We could simply point out that leather belts weren't exactly uncommon wardrobe in those days, and that would be enough. But there's actually more to it. Bear in mind what I said earlier about probabilities. A teacher, speaker, or writer would purposely call upon an older text in order to send their audience a message. It's clear from reports that John wanted people to recognize him as the new Elijah. Well, if that's the case, what better way for the historical John to do this than to imitate Elijah, right down to the particulars of his wardrobe highlighted in the Old Testament. So rather than Mark inventing symbolic history, what we have is John the Baptist enacting symbolic history. The bottom line is that whereas fundy atheists assume that the New Testament authors used the words of the Old Testament to create the events, the reality is that the New Testament authors used the events to extract the words from the Old Testament and use them to tell stories of what happened in their day. In further installments of this mini-series, we'll look at some examples of how this can be done even in modern times, and then show how the biblical writers pursued their craft. So, there you go. That's a far better explanation than your popular themes canard. How's that grab you?
Hey, listen here. I'm an expert in paleontology, and I say...
Oh, shut up! Now that's funny.